A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to day 2 of the China and the Maritime Silk Road Symposium webinar. My name is Lester Liu. It's my pleasure to be your MC for this 3-day symposium. So let us now commence our first panel on ports and maritime trade routes. Now, this panel will present papers on the nature of the ports and maritime trade routes along the Maritime Silk Road. Our panel chair for this session is Mr. Clement On. Mr. On is the Senior Curator of Asian Export Art and Peranakan at the Asian Civilizations Museum, Singapore. He has co-curated the exhibition Christianity in Asia, Sacred Art and Visual Splendor, contributed articles on the subject of Christian art in India, Japan, and China, and has co-edited the catalogue Port Cities, Multicultural Emporiums of Asia 1500 to 1900. He's currently overseeing the Maritime Trade, Court and Company, and also Christian Art Galleries, and is in charge of the curatorial direction at the Peranakan Museum. Mr. Clement On will be introducing our speakers, and don't forget we will be having a question and answer session with all our guests tuning in. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to hand the time over to our panel chair, Mr. Clement On. Mr. On, please.
Thank you, Lester. Very good morning to everyone, distinguished guests, friends, colleagues from Singapore and all over the world. We are about to begin this morning's webinar. I would like to mention a few housekeeping matters, just keeping it briefly. Firstly, for this morning's panel, we will have all the panelists to present and share with us their research. And after which a discussion will happen and followed by taking the Q&A from our webinar participants. So keep your questions coming via the chat, and I hope that we could get through as much as we can. We have 2 panelists who will be presenting in Chinese Mandarin. There is simultaneous interpretation, as Lester mentioned, from Chinese to English and English to Chinese. So for those who need either one of those languages, please make sure that you tune into the right settings below. I also would like to seek your understanding that there is some time lag or checking in of queries during the interpretation in progress, so please bear with us. Lastly, you'll be extremely helpful for me and the panelists if you could keep your questions short and to the point. It would be great if you can also identify yourself and the institution or the association that you belong to. This panel is about ports and maritime trade routes. For thousands of years, the cultures of Asia have traded, interacted, and exchanged ideas across the sea. And this has brought about the constant movement of people, goods, and ideas. By studying ports and trading network patterns, it shows global demand and shifting of tastes from region to region across different periods. Sometimes there is continuity, sometimes perhaps disjointed and fragmented. So these encounters and interaction between cultures have shaped our world and continues to do so today. The 5 presentations we are about to hear will present evidence, either archaeological findings or historical records of global exchanges between early port cities of the 9th to 17th century. Allow me to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Andrew Chittig. The title of his presentation is Maritime Trade and the Transformation of the Chinese Ceramics Industry. Dr. Andrew Chittig received his PhD in history from the University of Michigan in 1997 and is the E. Lester Peter Professor of East Asian Humanities and History at the Eckerd College in Florida. He researches the history of the Qinglong Empire, also known as the Chinese Southern Dynasty. Dr. Andrew Chittig, please.
Thank you, Clement, thank you to the Asian Civilizations Museum for having me join this august company of scholars and to kick it off with my talk. My paper offers a case study of the impact of maritime trade on the Chinese economy. It's the result of 4 months residence at the Asian Civilizations Museum back in spring of 2018, for which I want to express my gratitude to Stephen Murphy, Denise Simbel, Kan Shui, and the generosity of the National Heritage Board. The focus of my research was the bulk cargo of something like 60,000 ceramic bowls on the Belitung shipwreck, which made up about 96% of the total cargo. The ship went down in the early 9th century during a brief period in which ships from the Middle East sailed all the way to Chinese ports. Let's see if I can get the internet clicker to work. I'm not getting the internet clicker to work here. Ah, there we go. The shipwreck and its cargo have many stories to tell, but I want to focus on just one of them, which is the network of relationships that ordered and then produced this cargo and got it to the sea, and what that can tell us about the impact of maritime trade on Chinese commercial activity and ceramics production. The two key regions of the Tang Empire that facilitated this were the ceramics kiln site just north of Changsha and the maritime port city of Yangzhou. So let me start with Yangzhou. And first, I just want to observe that scholars have, I think, somewhat overemphasized Guangzhou as the center of the East Asian maritime economy. In the first millennium, both the Red River Delta of what's now northern Vietnam and the Yangtze Delta were also very important centers of trade. And Yangzhou, which I've shown here, was a sprawling commercial metropolis of over 500,000 persons, with much larger settlements of Persians and Arabs than any previous Yangtze Delta city, partly due to ties to Chang'an and the overland Silk Route via the Grand Canal, but also due to more aggressive maritime trade from the Arab Empire. So archaeological finds in Yangzhou have suggested to us how this diaspora community helped move goods through the city. Still kind of slow on the internet clicker, there it goes. One project excavated the brick foundations for houses of wealthy foreign merchants, which included Persian ceramics and glassware, Changsha ceramics such as this jar shown here, and also Yue, Ding, and Gongqian ware, all of which were also found on the Belitung ship. So the profile of goods on this ship is very similar. A second excavation, which was in the canal just a few hundred meters from the house, yielded a significant further cache of ceramics, including more from Changsha, suggesting they were brought by canal barge right through the middle of town. And a third dig recovered evidence of the wooden planking from Tang period docks along the former riverbank, as well as the wooden remains of two large river barges of the type that might have transported ceramics from further upriver. The diaspora community in Yangzhou played a pivotal role in developing what I would call the economic logic for long-distance ceramics trade. First, they were able to see what was available and commission what they thought would sell in Arab markets. Since ceramics had to be shipped by sea, the market could only really be developed by an Arab diaspora community that was based in a seaport. Yangzhou was really one of the first East Asian port cities to have one. Second, the Arab ships needed a very large quantity of ceramic ware in order to justify sailing so far and at such tremendous risk. It took them about 1.5 years to go from the Persian Gulf to Yangzhou. So they needed a product that would appeal to a broad range of Baghdad society, not just to royalty, but actually to merchants and to lesser nobility. High-value ceramics from the best Chinese kilns were actually a bit too expensive for this and not suited to most Arab tastes. So what the shippers really needed was what I would call mass market luxury. The Changsha bowls developed for this purpose had very little domestic market within the Tang Empire, as we know from widespread archaeological data. So that means the kiln operators had to make them to order because they wouldn't want to make 60,000 bowls if they didn't have a guaranteed purchaser. And the purchasing agents at Yangzhou would not want to place an order until they were sure there was a ship that they could load them onto. Otherwise, they'd be forced to load and unload them and store them potentially for long periods of time. Finally, the point here is that it put a lot of pressure on the manufacturers. Middle Eastern ships arrived at Guangzhou on the early southwestern monsoon in late April and made it to Yangzhou perhaps a month later in May. They docked along the riverbank for several months, and then they would have headed south on the first winds of the northeast monsoon in October. So the entire production order really had to be filled within that time window. Chinese kilns had not previously dealt with this kind of production pressure, and if they hadn't been able to do it, Arab ships probably would not have found it profitable to sail all the way to China at this time. They could have gotten Chinese goods in Southeast Asia as they had been doing for centuries. So how did the kilns manage to do this? Well, for that, we need to turn our glance upriver to Changsha. So, see if it will advance here. Nope, it went back to the beginning. Oh no, there it is. That's good. The Yangzhou kilns had long produced some of China's finest celadon wares, and the Shoju Kilns, just 30 kilometers south, were likely started as an offshoot or a rival by the 7th century. The very earliest ware made at Shoju was very similar to the Yangzhou ware, but soon gained name brand recognition in its own right. We are fortunate to have a firsthand observation of these kilns from the 9th century poet Li Chunyu, which I won't bother to read. The Shoju Kilns pioneered 3 important innovations to fulfill the needs of Arab purchasing agents. The first of these was the technology of polychrome underglazing. Now, glazes have very complex chemistry which can react unpredictably to firing, so mastering how to get several different high-fired glazes to all fire properly on a single item is very challenging. The Shoju Kilns were the first to produce significant quantities of high-fired underglazed ceramics in multiple colors. The second important innovation of the Changsha Kilns was in design. The free-form linear designs on Changsha bowls are quite unusual in Chinese ceramicware up to this time. It's likely that Arab purchasing agents preferred these styles and ordered more of them from the kilns, as Dr. Respis is scheduled to discuss in panel 3. The result was an outburst of creative approaches to decorative design. And the third and perhaps most remarkable breakthrough was in the scale and capacity of production. The order for the Belitung cargo was for around 60,000 bowls, with delivery to be taken in just a few months' time. There's no evidence that any other famous kilns in this era produced ceramic ware at anything like this scale and this speed. So how did they do it? Well, let's take a closer look at the core area of the kiln site. It's actually quite small, only about 1 kilometer across. The map will come up in just a moment here. There it is. Modern archaeology has revealed more than 40 kilns in just this small area. So there it is, right there. The largest, Tanjapo, is in a museum. It's a dragon kiln running up a hill about 42 meters with a firing capacity of something like 10,000 items. And surrounding the kiln is evidence of workshops that account for all of the stages of the production process. The site where the clay was prepared and the bowls were thrown, the pits which held the throwing wheels, and an area with a large pit for cooking down the glazes. In the upper left are small pits where different colors of glazes were stored for the polychrome. This scale model from the Tanjapo Relic Museum suggests what the site might have looked like in the 9th century. So based on this archaeology, we can make some educated hypotheses about how the system of production functioned. First, it must have had a core group of skilled craftsmen who could perform the most technically complex functions: firing kilns, mixing glazes, and throwing the ware, including the bowls. This core skilled group would have been continuously affiliated with the kiln and most likely were members of one household or several closely associated households. They would have lived at the kiln year-round and produced most of the regular work which was made for the domestic market and which dominates the archaeological site of the kilns themselves. We have textual evidence for this sort of structure in Tang texts, which use terms such as taojia, ceramics household, and yaojia, kiln household. But we also have direct evidence because they advertise themselves using their surnames as brand names. The most famous example, of course, is a bowl from the Belitung shipwreck, which is in the Asian Civilizations Museum, which brags that it's the famous family brand bowl from Shiju, a village market of Hunan Circuit. But there are many other examples. Here, for example, is a Changsha ewer in the collection of the Hunan Provincial Museum, which is inscribed with the surname of the Zhang family. And here's another one in the Changsha Museum with the name of the He family. Other objects discovered at the kiln site bear the names of many other kiln clans. Most likely, these are the households that managed individual kilns. But the massive order of bowls for the Belitung cargo would have required that these households greatly expand their production process by a large unskilled labor force that could do the less technically complex tasks. That would include digging and wedging the clay, cutting and hauling fuel wood, loading and unloading kilns, dipping the bowls into slip and overglaze, and perhaps even painting the designs. The timing worked well with the agricultural labor cycle in between the busy season when rice seed was sown in late April or early May and the harvest in October. The Belitung bowls themselves can be used as evidence for this production process. Now, Changsha exportware has been found in over 29 countries all over the world, from Japan to Egypt, but the shipwreck cargo is unique because it represents the fulfillment of one single large purchase order, all made in the course of a few months. So when I was at the museum, I studied a selection of the bowls looking for correlation between those features of the bowls that arose from the clay making or throwing stage, such as the type of clay body or the shape of the foot, and the decorating phase, such as the painted design or the nature of the glaze. If the two correlate, as they do in this example, it suggests that the bowls were made using a household-based production process in which the throwing, low firing, and decorating were done in small workshops before being sent to a central kiln for the final high firing process. If they did not correlate, that would imply the use of a more centralized process. The details of my preliminary study, which are in my written paper, suggest some of the challenges of doing this sort of work on a larger scale, but my initial case study suggests that the production work was largely based in households, but with a centralized kiln firing process whose management team coordinated the production run. Evidence from kilns in later areas in other parts of China shows this system became widespread along with other elements of the Changsha production system, such as polychrome underglaze. So in conclusion, I would point out that the Arabs stopped sailing directly to China by the early 10th century and thereby broke the network of human relationships that had sustained the Changsha kilns. And the kilns also likely exhausted the local natural environment, primarily the supply of wood, at about the same time. So this double problem resulted in the collapse of the Changsha kilns, and they never recovered. But the impact of this on their ceramics industry was permanent. On the demand side, once hard-fired ceramics became an affordable mass market item rather than an expensive luxury, Southeast Asian shipmasters began carrying large cargoes of them to markets in Java and elsewhere, as the 10th century Intan and Cheraban shipwrecks have shown us. Whereas on the production side, other kilns along the coast, such as at Longchuan, Dihua, and all around Guangzhou, took over the high-volume trade. The case study of Changsha ceramics might help us to understand maritime trade's early impact on other commodities, such as the silk industry. But it's important to note that Southeast Asians had been sailing in large capacity ships from Chinese to Southeast Asian ports for many centuries before the Arabs, and yet did not have the same impact on the ceramics industry. It's worth considering why not. One often suggested answer is their smaller urban markets, but another is their more routine trips, which lessen the need for rapid mass market production. This is a good question for further research. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for the very interesting, insightful research, and I hope you enjoy your time with us at the Asian Civilization Museum.
I did very much.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce the next speaker we have this panel. The next speaker is Dr. Chen Jie, and the title of his presentation is Qinglong City, Shanghai Maritime Trade Port from the Tang to Song Dynasty. Dr. Chen Jie is the Deputy Director of Shanghai Museum, the Director of China Archaeological Society, Deputy Director of Shanghai Society of Anthropology, and Director of the Director of the Committee of Technological Analysis of Cultural Treasures at the China Association for Preserving Technology of Cultural Relics. He was named an outstanding expert of the Ministry of Culture of the People's Republic of China, and is also a recipient of the Shanghai May 1st Labor Day Medal. Dr. Chen Jie, please.
大家好，非常高兴能够在这里跟大家分享我们上海地区青龙镇遗址的考古发现。从青龙镇遗址来说的话，实际上是它在我们上海具有非常重要的这样一个意义。它是上海古代文献里面记载最早建立的一个镇。它据记载的话，它是在唐代天宝5年就设立了。天宝5年，也就是说公元746年，它比它的这个上海最早设立的县还更早。唐代天宝10年设置的当时的华亭县，也就是上海最早的一个政府建制。当然，这个文献记载是比较晚的时候记载的。但是在北宋的一些地理的书里面就已经有了青龙镇的记载，包括到后期的话，青龙镇的记载越来越多。然后它这里面讲了它就是当时候海船聚集的地方，然后这里面有很多的富商巨贾在这地方生存，有人把它称为小杭州。另外一个青龙镇呢，就是我们在文献记载里面是上海地区最早的一个对外贸易港口。因为在北宋的文献里面就记载了青龙镇它实际上是海商聚集的地方，然后在南宋的一些文献里面也具体记载了 青龙镇的位置，它居于这个吴淞江的南边，然后也是海商聚集的这样一个地方，而且在北宋的一些文献里面，还记载了它这个很多当时贸易繁盛的这样一个情况，特别是为了便于这个贸易管理，在南宋时期曾经在青龙镇专门设置了有市舶务进行这种对外贸易的这样一个管理。但是这个青龙镇的话，实际上是可能是随着港口的兴衰的话，它在南宋以后，逐渐的衰落，这跟河道的变迁是有一定关系的。现在我们能够看到的青龙镇的遗迹的话，非常地面上的遗迹非常少。我们右上角这张图的话是现在能够保存当地的比较显著的一个大概是宋代这样一个建筑，最早它的所属于的寺院是唐代建立的，号称是青龙寺。其他的话我们在地表已经找不出来很多跟与这个旧的青龙镇相关的遗迹，但是我们也有一些考古的一些遗迹。比如在20世纪80年代，我们曾经在当地进行开河的时候，发现一个古井，古井里面就发现了一些藏沙窑的这样一个瓷器，所以我们当时候认为在这个青龙镇可能埋在这个林地里面，埋在稻田下面的，可能还有一些唐宋时期的这个青龙镇的古迹，所以我们在2010年开始就对青龙镇进行了一些考古发掘。考古发掘，我们首先对它进行了考古钻探。我们经过了多年的工作，基本明确了这种它的整个的青龙镇的这个分布的一个特征。它基本上是沿着我们中间可以看到右边这张图，它沿着中间的有一条叫通波塘，分布的。然后总共呢是形成了一个南北狭长的这样一个布局，沿河分布的这样一个特点。这种分布特点跟现在的很多江南水乡市镇布局特征非常的相似。这是江南水乡的一个布局特征，基本上临河分布的这样一个特点。在2010年之后，我们也对青龙镇遗址进行了多次的发掘，前后的发掘的总面积呢达到了5000多平方米。通过考古发掘呢，发现了唐宋时期的很多建筑的遗址、灰坑、墓葬、水井、炉灶、铸造作坊、佛塔遗迹等等，也是能够为我们复原青龙镇唐宋时期的面貌提供了非常重要的这样一个证据。这个是宋代的一个建筑基址，它有的是4开间的，有的2开间的，有的是单开间的这样一个房屋。下一张是唐代的一个水井，水井很多，然后这是比较典型的一个唐代水井。这是我们发掘人员在这个进行发掘，然后出土了包括这个铜镜，包括这个当时生活用的铁鼎、铁釜等一些器物，还有包括一些装饰用品。当然，我们这么多年青龙镇遗址发掘非常重要的一个发现，就是发现了大量的贸易陶瓷和相关遗迹，为我们确证这个青龙镇是唐宋时期海上丝绸之路的重要港口之一，提供了非常重要的这样一个证据。这是在考古发现中发现了一些唐代瓷器堆积的这种情况，包括还在一些调查过程中发现了可能跟河埠头相关的，就是可能小码头相关的一些遗迹。历年来，在青龙镇遗址发现的这瓷器数量是非常的多的。我们现在可以修复的瓷器，就有6、7千件，这是其中一部分可以修复的瓷器在我们整理场所所展现的这样一个情况。根据我们的队员们对这个出土瓷器的这样一个分类，它在唐代和宋代，实际上它的瓷器的种类是不太一样的。唐代的瓷器最主要以长沙窑瓷器、越窑瓷器和上海附近的德清窑的瓷器最多。 也有少量的这种来自北方的非常少量的来自北方的这种邢窑和巩义窑的瓷器。到了宋代以后，青龙镇遗址发现的瓷器最主要有龙泉窑、闽清的就福建地区的闽清义窑、建窑等地区等这种产品，也有一些江西的像景德镇窑、吉州窑等这样一个产品。我们的那个考古队员，然后对这个遗址出土的瓷器，按照这个特征进行了分类。分类的结果，我们做了一个图形显示，发现非常有意思。因为上海离浙江很近，但是我们现在发现更多的是来自于福建地区的窑口的瓷器，有少量的一部分20%几的这样比例是来自于浙江，其他还有一些来自于湖南、江西和一些可能没有确定窑口的这样一个地区的一个瓷器。为什么有这样一个现象？我们可以把它跟文献结合起来。我们把这个发现瓷器的地点在地图上进行了标识。我们发现很多来自于浙江南部和福建地方的地区这瓷器，到上海这个地区汇集上跟文献记载是有一定关系的。包括在文献记载里面，有一句话就是，在当时候的唐代的唐宋时期的青龙镇，贸易非常的繁盛。在来自于青龙镇附近的，像杭州、苏州、湖州、常州的，每个月或者隔几天就到了青龙镇进行贸易。然后再远一点的，福州、建州、漳州、泉州、明州、越州、温州、台州等地的，一年里面也要来2、3次。这些地方正好是很多都是当时候的瓷器的生产地。再远一点的，就是对外贸易了。然后像当时的广南，就是现在的越南，包括日本和新罗，每个月都要到这儿来进行贸易。这是我们从考古发现上可以跟文献进行一些印证。所以我们推测它的一个贸易路线基本上是从南向北，然后逐渐主要是面对东北亚地区的我们一个体现了这个青龙镇的这样一个地位。然后我们在这个几年发现里面还有非常重要的一个发现，我们就发现了一个叫龙平寺的这样一个塔基。这个塔基既是一个佛教的这样一个重要的一个考古发现，同时它在文献记载里面，它也是青龙镇遗址非常重要的一个关键性的地标，也对我们认识当时的宗教生活提供了非常重要的这样一个材料。我们可以看到这图上，现在刚才我们给大家看到的一个立在地面上的叫青龙塔。它在文献里面记载是这个遗址的南寺，然后龙平塔是它的北寺。这是在遗址里面发现的这种塔基的一个基本情况，呈八角形，然后有这个塔的主体和它一些外围廊为主，然后下面是它一些出土的一些局部情况。因为时间的关系，不给大家具体的展示。我们上海地区发现了很多的这个早期的这种古塔，很多都是立于地表以上，但对于地面以下的这种建筑结构的话，实际上是不太清楚的。所以我们这一次考古发掘专门对这个古塔的内部结构进行了一些解剖式的发掘。我们做了一些探沟，在塔的中心部位。不好意思，我操作不了我的 PPT。可以到下一章。我们对这个塔基部分进行了解剖的式发掘，把它的塔心室地方向下进行发掘，发现很复杂的一个梁架结构。我们对它的外围也进行了一些解剖。 我现在好像，这有了，它的很慢。这是我们的一些解剖沟。我们对整个塔基的结构，特别是地下的结构，特别的，通过考古发掘可以特别清晰的了解它的一个地下结构。在这个塔基的结构的清理过程中，我们非常有幸也发现了这个塔的地宫部分的。可以，请帮我放下一页。好的，这是我们地宫的地宫部分的这种遗迹。这是我们地宫揭开后的，好，可以下一张。这是我们地宫揭开以后，它这个整个地宫溢埋里面的一些器物的这种情况，请放下一张。这是在地宫里面出土的一些文物，这是阿育王塔2座阿育王塔。再下一张。我们在2座阿育王塔中间，我们刚才看到是一套木函，因为我们知道它的佛教的义埋制度，它7套函，但是我们当时没有在现场进行这个文物的提取，我们拿到实验室后，首先进行了XCT 的这样一个扫描，了解了文物的基本特性，然后进行了这种清理。再下一张。这是我们逐渐清理的，最外层是一层木函，中间是个铁函。再下一张。然后这个铁函打开之后，有很多的这种水晶的佛珠。再下一张。然后包括还有这个铁函打开之后，中间又有木函又有银函，然后还有更多的这种出土的这种文物。再下一张，谢谢。再下一张嘛。这中间是我们的随葬的那个释迦牟尼的卧佛像，然后我们的把这些水晶珠然后都串联起来，大概有3串的这种水晶佛珠。再下一张，谢谢。这是其他一些文物。再下一张。这是最中心的小盒里面出土的释迦牟尼的卧佛像，还有在旁边出土的一些像舍利瓶和中间所藏的这样一个舍利。再下一张，谢谢。再下一张，谢谢。实际上是我通过青龙镇这样一个遗址的话，我们觉得这个考古非常重要，因为它激活了文献中关于青龙镇历史的一些模糊记载。因为我们在2010年之前对于我们上海青龙镇这个遗址的话，了解更多是通过文献，但是文献里面记载是语言不详的，很多内容是比较少的。但是呢，我们的考古发现又直接能够跟我们现在的文献能够直接对应。比如他讲到这个龙平寺塔建立的时候，当时候一个很重要的目的就是作为航标塔的功能。当时候青龙镇曾经遇到一个情况，就是因为当时的河口非常的宽，所以很多的船只到了这个海口之后就找不到港口所在，所谓的叫百无一二能入。但是建立这个塔之后，迅速的发生了这个效果，包括附近的杭州、苏州等地的这个船每个月都来，然后远一点的福建建州等地的地方每年要来2、3次，再远一点就是到了越南和日本和这个现在的这种朝鲜半岛地区，所以这个地方就变成了非常繁华的一个地方。然后另外一个，实际上它当时的繁华形象的话，还可以通过文献的一些数据来比较。当时候有一个文献记载的话，唐青龙镇在北宋时期熙宁10年，它的税收水平达到了15000多贯这样一个水平。实际上这个水平的话，在当时的州县一级也是属于比较高的，甚至它超过它上一级的华泾县城的一些税收的收入，反映了它在这个整个贸易体系中非常重要的这样一个地位。再下一张。 另外，实际上是我们也知道，上海地区，上海的话现在也是发展它的贸易功能，要打造它的国际航运中心。实际上，我们这样一个考古的一个发现，实际上也为我们上海城市的发展找到一个重要的这样一个历史基因。因为我们从这样的一个整个的考古发现来讲的话，确认上海它整个城市的发展就是一个以港兴市、以水兴市的这样一个过程。它的最早的这样一个溯源可以推溯到我们青龙镇这个时期，包括在青龙镇曾经设立世博物，然后它的因为吴淞江的淤塞之后，它的整个的贸易中心或者这个政治中心就放到了上海县到上海镇，然后最后再发展到我们现在的上海港，所以我们的历史是跟我们是联系的，跟现在这样一个城市发展是联系在一起的。因为时间的关系，就不跟大家再更多的让一个分享。有什么问题的话，大家可以问我。谢谢大家。
Thank you very much, Dr. Chen Jie. Let's move to the third speaker for this morning's panel. He's Dr. Haining. His title of this presentation is Archaeological Findings of the Nanjing Treasure Shipyard Sites Excavation. Dr. Haining is currently Deputy Director and Research Associate at the Nanjing Archaeology Institute. He has been involved with many archaeological excavations and research projects in Nanjing since 1995. His main area of research is the archaeology of Ming Dynasty Nanjing. He has led several major archaeological excavations, such as the Nanjing Treasure Shipyard site between 2003 to 2004, General Mu Ying's family burial site in Jiangning district between 2005 to 2012, and the Great Bao'en Temple site in Nanjing 2008 to 2014. Dr. Qi, please.
好的，各位专家，上午好。我是以前是在南京市考古研究院工作啊。那么我从去年开始调到了南京师范大学，我现在也是一位教授。那么我今天想跟大家汇报的呢，是我2003年到2004年所主持的一项考古工作。各位工作人员，我好像看不到我的 PPT， 我的屏幕上看不到我的 PPT。能帮我操作一下吗？大家能看到吗？我看不到我的 PPT。
好，戚海宁教授，请稍等一下啊，我们帮你检查一下。
对。
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, hello everybody, welcome back. So I'm Lester, I'm the MC. We're just going to sort out this technical difficulty because our speakers are actually all in their respective locations. In this case, as Dr. Chi has mentioned, he is actually in Nanjing, I believe. So please stand by. Let us sort out this technical difficulty. Let us ensure that he's able to see his screen. 可以看得到吗？戚海宁老师。
好的，非常好，已经解决了，非常好，解决了。
解决了，好，可以。
好的，
谢谢你。
好，那我就向大家汇报一下我的这个 PPT。这个项目呢，是我们03年到04年做的一些项目。为什么在那个时候做呢？因为那个时候2005年正好是大家都知道郑和下西洋的600周年是2005年。那么2003年到04年，我们南京市的地方政府呢，就为了迎接这个郑和下西洋的这个600周年到来呢，就是专门组织了我们这个考古单位对这个南京的一个非常重要的遗址，就是宝船厂遗址进行了一个发掘。这个宝船厂遗址在什么位置呢？请下一页。我还是不能操纵我的 PPT。工作人员，请帮我放到下一页。这个宝船厂啊，Sorry, I can't control it.
好，季海宁老师，请问一下，你要看的是哪一面呢？
什么？
哪一面呢？哪一片呢？
第二页，
第二页。好，我们回去第二页。
地图，第二张
地图。好，你待会可以讲下一页，我们就帮你换一下，好不好？好，谢谢。So, ladies and gentlemen, just do a
看不到。
simple translation. So we apologize for the delay. So apparently there's some lag in the time when Dr. Chi is not able to control the slide. So we apologize for this technical difficulty, but we will resume now very shortly. 季海宁老师，请。
已经到第二页了吗？我屏幕上看不到。
对，我们现在在地图那面。
好的，那我来跟大家说吧，没事。
好。
那个。这个宝船厂遗址在南京城的这个西北部，它是在我们可以在这个地图上看到，它是紧邻的南京的长江。南京呢是一个城市，它有一江一河，江就是长江，河呢最主要的河流是秦淮河，秦淮河也是南京的母亲河。那么我们这个宝船厂遗址就在这个秦淮河和长江的交汇口。那么根据明代文献的记载呢，这个宝船厂遗址在南京城的西北部，它是在永乐3年这个由明成祖朱棣来创建的。那么这个永乐3年正好是郑和下西洋那当年创造的。那么这个我们请看下一页。这个我现在看到这个第3页这个地图呢，是我们南京1946年的一幅老的地图。在这个地图上面，大家可以仔细看到。不光可以看到我们的这个河道，这个秦淮河道长江，还可以看到在这个紧邻的这个长江边上有13条这个西南向东北走向倾斜的这么一条这个水塘的遗迹。那么这些水塘，我们当时看到地图上可以数一数，在1940年代的时候，当时还称下来13条水塘。那么这些水塘经过我们这个后面的考古发掘的这个研究来证实。它实际上就是造船的这个船坞。那么在46年的时候还有13条，那么可惜我们保护的不是特别好，到了70年代、80年代的时候，只剩下了大概7条座塘。那么当时的考古工作者对这个7条座塘进行了调查和研究，给他们进行了编号，那么是从1号编到了7号。那么在这个我们是在2003年是对其中的第6号座塘进行了这个发掘。那么刚才我跟大家介绍了这个发掘的主要的目的，就是因为这个宝船厂遗址，实际上我们在从明朝以后，在民国时候，这个地方还叫做宝船滩，就是这个宝船厂这个地名在文献当中，还有在老百姓的口碑当中。都知道这个地方是当年郑和下西洋造船的基地，就是它这个遗址是有文献记载，也有口碑传承的。那么，但是在以往的工作当中，我们在50年代的时候，有当地是农民在这个座塘里面曾经发现过造船的这个舵杆啊，这个铁锚啊这些船上的用具，其中有一条很大的舵杆，长13米的这个操作船的这个舵杆被我们中国国家博物馆收藏，现在收藏在国家博物馆北京。大家有机会到北京中国国家历史博物馆参观的时候，就可以看到这个舵杆。这个舵杆就是在南京宝船厂遗址第6号座塘里面出土的，它的出土时间是1957年的左右。那么在2003年的时候，那么我们对这个宝船厂这个6号塘进行了一次正式的考古发掘，就是我们所做的工作。就是这个第6座塘就正式的考古发掘。好，请童主任把它翻到我们那个座塘的这个全景图，第5页全景图。在这张照片上面，大家可以看到，这是我们发掘完之后的这个座塘的这个情况。这个座塘呢，是全长，当时这个全长我们发掘的时候还称下420米，但是我们认为它的原始的长度肯定不止这么一个长度，估计在600米以上。在这个座塘我们清理完之后，它的整个造型呢，应该是一个倒梯形。 上面宽，上口宽44米，这个底部呢宽15米左右，15米左右。它的深度，它的从这个地表到它的这个座堂底部的深度是3.5米。我们清理的时候，它全部都是被淤泥所覆盖的。那么我们发掘的时候是把这些淤泥给清除掉以后，把它整个座堂的这个面貌给揭露出来。这个座堂是当地老百姓的口语。那么实际上，如果按照我们的这个专用的术语的话，它就是船坞，应该叫 shipyard 船坞。在座堂底部呢，我们发现了34个造船的平台。根据我们这个考古发掘的做揭示的这个情况呢，我们对这个平台呢起了不同的名字。请工作人员翻到下一页，第6页。我们把它这个各种平台呢起了一个不同，这个是一个最简单的平台，它都是用一圈木桩把它围绕起来的。但是大家可以看到，在它的这个座堂最底部，平台最底部实际上结构很复杂，它又打了很密集的这个木桩，还平铺了横向的这个木头。这个竖的木桩，这个文献当中叫做地钉，打入地的地钉。这个横向的木头，古代文献中叫做龙骨。这个地钉和龙骨呢，就是在这种做法呢，是中国传统的一个做法，它的作用就是在比较松软的地基里，比如说像河道啊，像河边的漫滩上面，松软的地基上面，为了建造各种建筑所采用的一些这个基础设施。那么这种是木桩圈形的这么一个遗迹，这种遗迹大概有30多个，是我们在这个座堂里面发现最多的。那这是另外一种遗迹，稍微复杂一点，我们把它认为叫做框架型的，它是用木材搭成的这个长方形的框架，在这个框架的里面还是有这个木桩和地钉，它不同的结构可能是起到了不同的程度的作用。那我们看看那个，请工作人员翻到第8页，第8页这是一个比较复杂的这么一个造船的遗迹，这个旁边的这个遗迹也是，你看大家可以看到这个龙骨和地钉很密集，也是用框架围绕起来的。但是在这个遗迹的边上，大家可以看到堆放了很多的木材和工具，这些木材都是这些木材很多都是船板，就是当年那个船上使用的木板。很多工具，大家可以看到这个工具，有一种工具我们大家叫做 T 型称，像个大写字母的 T 一样。我们认为它是从这个侧向造船的时候，从侧面顶住这个船身的作用，是这么一个作用。说在这个座堂底部还保存了很多造船的工具和这个船板。第9页我们看得更仔细一点，什么工具？这个里面有这个木锤，还有木夯。都是为了敲击这个船板作用，还有敲击船板作用的。还有这个木板，大家看到木板边上还有这个一个一个的小眼，这是钉孔，这都是当年这个木质造船工业的这个实物。那么我们看到第10页，请翻到第10页。第10页看到我们这是一个非常复杂的这么一个造船的平台，它分为好几层，最底部的就是地钉。然后上面用横向的铺了这个木料，在最上面又竖向的铺了木料。我们认为这样它在原始的形态当中，它应该能堆得很高。我们大家知道船身，一个船它的长度最底部的时候，它的龙骨底部是接触到这个底部的，但是它的这个船头和船尾它有一个弧度，它就需要有比较高大的平台。那么我们认为这个地方层层叠叠的叠加型的这种层垒型的这个遗迹，我们认为它可能是支撑船头和船尾的这个部分的。那么在这个遗迹边上，也能够发现很多船板和造船的工具。而且我们对这个造船的这个木材在这个座堂里面这些木材，无论是木桩也好，木质的工具也好，我们都进行过碳摄式的检测，检测的数据正好跟郑和下西洋的时代是吻合的，就是这些木材正好是郑和下西洋那个时代所遗留下来的，那就也证明了我们这个船坞6座堂的这个时代应该就是明朝初年永乐皇帝期间。这是在座堂底部发现的遗迹的一些情况。那么我们很幸运的是，在这个座堂里面，我们还发现了很多遗物。这些遗物呢是请这个 工作页翻到第11页，第11页。这些遗物呢，我们可以从质地上来分，可以分为好多种，有木质的，有铁质的，还有石质的、陶瓷的等等。那么如果从功能上来划分的话，它可以分为3类，一种是造船设施，一种叫做造船工具，另外一种是船上的构件。如果还有一种的话，第4类的话就是工人的生活用具，可以分为这四大类。我们具体来看一看。请翻到第12页。第12页可以看到这个是一个龙骨，这是一个水车的龙骨。那么根据我们这个明代天工开物的这张图，它的用途就是一个水车上的构件。我们知道这个造船的时候，这个船坞里面应该是干燥的，它应该把水全部给抽干。怎么抽干？就用这个水车来抽。那么等船造好了之后，它要把江水再放到这个船坞里面来，让船浮起来，然后通过船闸离开这个船坞，然后它又需要水车。等它这个船走了以后，再把水抽干，再进行第2轮的造船工艺。所以说这个构件呢，就是水车龙骨的一个构件，是当年这个造船设施一个很必要的设施。那么我们再往下翻，看到这些工具，这是一个第14页，应该是个木锤，是工人使用的木锤。第15页，大家看到他们这个木锤上面还有一个官字，用中文写的官字，英文应该翻成叫 official。这个意思是什么意思？就是说这个工具不是私人的，它是属于这个政府所有的，是属于国营工厂所有的。从这个工具上的这个铭文也可以证明，这个宝船厂是当时政府投资建造的大型的这个船厂，跟文献记载的郑和下西洋这个大船厂的这个性质是一致的。好，那么我们看看其他的工具。这个工具是我们把它叫做刮刀，它的作用是什么呢？因为大家都知道船是用木质造的，但是木板之间是有缝隙的，如果这种缝隙如果不填满的话，下海是很危险的。那么如何来连接这些缝隙呢？除了用铁钉之外，还需要用这个我们中文叫做油泥，就是一种填缝剂，用这些木质刮刀把填缝剂很仔细。喂，您好，你翻译的有问题吗？喂，
H 海英老师，你可以继续，没问题。
没问题，好的。那么这个木质的刮刀就是把这个油泥这个浸到这个船缝当中，保质这个船不渗水。这是当时就是因为当时没有这个焊接的工艺，是木板嘛，它只能用这种工艺，所以这个木质造船的代价是很大的。因为这个船下一次海，每次下海出海回来以后，都得在宝船厂里面再重新进行这个油泥的这个修补，就它的代价是很大的。这个当时都有文献记载，3年一修，就他出一次海回国以后，必须要对这个船进行修补。这是这个木质的刮刀。那这个工具呢，就是我们刚才讲的 T 形称，它像英文字母当中的 T 一样，它高高低低，有大小，有长有短，那就是支撑船的不同的部位。大家可以理解的，可以想象到，就是在船里面造船，它是从侧面支撑这个船体不倾斜。这都是木质工具。那么还有很多铁质工具，那这是铁斧我们在这个座舱里面发现的几十件这样的铁斧，都是当时用这个加工木材的。这是铁凿，也是铁质的工具，也是木工工具那这个是一捆铁钉，实际上我们在这个6号堂里面发现了几百枚铁钉。有不同的种类，有长的，有短的，有圆的，有圆头的，有扁头的，还有弯曲的。那我选的这一张照片呢，就是一个成捆的，它这个铁钉每一根都长度在50米左右，50个厘米左右，就0.5米左右，长度很长，是它的截面是方形的，而且它是一整捆。那么就说明这个宝船厂当年这个用钉量是很大的，而且从这个铁钉的长度来看，它是加工非常厚的这个船板的使用的，是这个毫无疑问，这个不是一般的 小船使用的铁钉，是很大的大船使用的铁钉。那么这个就是第21张图上我们看到这个是2坨油泥，刚才就是我讲的，用这个船板之间要填缝，就用这个油泥，这只是我们这个2坨油泥已经干燥了，变成了很干的这个团状的物质。实际上它当时使用的时候，它是用桐油、石灰、麻布混合而成的一种填缝剂，当时是呈这个油泥状的，现在已经干燥了，但是这2坨油泥还保存下来，是当时的这个填缝的工具。这个是船板，大家看到没有？是用钉子连第22页，这就是用钉子连接的船板，很多地方还加工成了这个云纹的这个造型。第23页的这个船板上面还有中文的铭文，我给大家解释一下，它的编号是右边尾1上2，就是什么？它右边的就是船右边的这个尾部的第1排上部的第2块木板，就说说明当时这个每一块船板上面基本上都有这个安装的这个编号，说明这个工厂的管理和整个造船的这个工艺是很严密的。这个也是其他的这个各种各样的造型的这个船板，我们现在已经不能够准确的知道它的这个船上的这个具体用途，但是我们知道它应该是船上的构件。而且这2个黑色的船板，我们做过木材的检测，我们中文叫做革木，古代的有一种特殊的名字叫铁梨木，因为它颜色像铁一样，像黑颜色铁一样。这种木材我们查阅过文献，只有在中国的广西、云南和东南亚的越南泰国一带生产这种木材，它的木质结构是很致密的。当时这个文献上记载，如果要造海船，必用铁梨木，就是如果要做长途运输的，像能够到东南亚出洋的这种大海船的话，铁梨木是上等的这个首选，因为它能够抵御海水的腐蚀，它不是我们内地能够生产的这种木材，所以说这些木材应该是从东南亚或者是中国南部运到南京加工而成的。这是其他的一些木质的构件，比如说有转盘、有绞盘。我们认为这个第4张图上这个是一个滑轮的构件，船上的用这个拉升升帆、降帆或者升锚、降锚需要缆绳，这是需要使用的滑轮，这是滑轮的构件。滑轮的构件。在这个六座堂里面，我们可以看到第26张图，我们在这个刚才我跟大家介绍了，在50年代6号堂里面就出土过一根大型的舵杆。那么这次考古发掘，我们在这个6号座堂里面又发现了2根大的舵杆，跟这个我们在北京中国国家博物馆里面的舵杆造型一样，材料一样。那么我们发现3根，那说明在当时这个宝船厂遗址一个堂里面，至少可以同时修造3条大型的这个宝船。那么我们发现了3条这么舵杆，这是1号舵杆发现的情况，它是由一根整树加工而成的。那么这个树它的舵杆长度在10米左右，那么这个完整的大树，铁梨木的大树，当年肯定要超过10米。这是另外一个舵杆发现的情况，这个也是将近11米长的这么一个舵杆，也是铁梨木的。我们可以看到当时这个淤泥的情况，这个宝船厂当时我们发掘的时候，它有3.5米的淤泥把它给覆盖住了，这也是当时这个宝船厂底下的遗迹和遗物能够保存的比较好的一个原因，因为它是明代废弃以后，它就变成一个水塘，淤泥不断淤积，把这些遗迹和遗物保存在座堂的下部。我们还发现了铁锚，这个在座堂还发现了铁锚，这是一个4爪的铁锚，这个。那么我们在50年代时候，在这个另外一个座堂里面也发现过大的铜锚，类似的，就是从这些舵杆铁锚这些构件来证明，我们发现的这个6号座堂，毫无疑问就是一个大型的造船的基地。那么我们在明代的文献当中也有记载，这个我们都知道，有个对郑和下西洋有了解的学者大概都知道，有一幅很著名的图叫做郑和航海图，它是收录在我们这个中文的文献当中，叫武备志，还有南苏志，都是明朝的文献。我们查过这个武备志和南苏志，它都是利用当时明朝兵部的档案，兵部就是国防部，国防部的档案编纂的，说明这个郑和航海图，这个航海图是当时明朝政府 国防部所收藏的这个军用的文献。在这个航海图的这个第一幅图首图就画了宝船厂的这个位置，它是在南京的这个皇城的这个西北部啊，这里有一个宝船厂，而且这幅图的原始的名字就叫自宝船厂开船，从龙江关出水，直抵外国诸藩图，意思就是说从宝船厂是从宝船是从宝船厂开船的，要经过龙江关，龙江关就是南京的这个海关，从宝船厂开船，经过龙江关，然后直达这个东南亚的各个国家，当时叫外国诸藩图，而且这个宝船厂就在南京的这个皇城的这个西北部。那么这个郑和航海图就证明了宝船厂第一是明朝时候存在，第二它的位置，第二它的功能，跟我们考古发掘，我们这次考古发掘出土的这些遗迹，这些34处的造船的遗迹和1500多件不同质地的文物，比如说木质的、铁质的各种这文物、造船工具，都证明了这个宝船厂的它的历史的存在和它的价值。那么我们都知道，郑和宝船厂它是造宝船的，它从永乐3年开始造船，那它承担了它的历史使命，它是明朝政府官营的一个大型的造船基地，专门为郑和下西洋所服务的。当然，经过我个人的研究，在郑和宝船厂这里造的船并不是最大号的宝船。我们知道大号宝船，它的据历史记载有长44米，长44丈，宽18丈，它的体量是非常大的。我个人认为这种大号宝船是存在的。那么我们在2009年左右，我们在南京发现了这个明朝这个郑和下西洋一个重要的太监，就是当时的一个船队的副司令洪宝的一个墓葬，在他的墓葬里面出土了一块木质，上面介绍大号宝船它的体量多大呢？是当它是叫5000辆，5000辆，它的体量它能够一艘船能够装载400个人左右。但是这种大号宝船，我们认为它是在福建沿海造的，因为它的失水太深，进入不了长江航道。在南京宝船厂，我认为它造的是中型宝船，它的体量是2000辆，它的装载量，它的一艘船上能装200个人左右，是这么一个情况。当时根据明代文献，郑和下西洋，它的船队构成是100多条船，其中大号宝船也不过是4、5条左右，绝大部分是2000辆船，他们是在郑和，就是在我们南京宝船厂建造的。那么我的汇报大概就这么一个情况，向大家介绍一下我们这个宝船厂的一个考古发现。可能今天这个技术原因，可能我讲的跟我的这个 PPT 对应不太好，所以麻烦这个工作人员帮我们我的情况给大家汇报一下。谢谢各位专家，谢谢我们这个新加坡的这个博物馆给我们这么一个机会，谢谢。
Thank you, Dr. Chi. We have allocated extra timing for Dr. Chi because of some of the technical difficulties. So thank you for bearing with us, and really sorry to Dr. Chi for the inconvenience caused. Our fourth speaker for today, for this panel, is Dr. Sureshkumar Muthukumaran. His title of his presentation is Between Diplomacy and Commerce, the Pallavas of the Kanchipuram and the Tang Court. Dr. Sureshkumar Muthukumaran is a postdoctoral fellow in the history of Yale-NUS. He specialized in the history of connectivity in ancient Eurasia with a particular focus on its biological aspects, the anthropogenic spread of flora, fauna, pests, commensals, and microbial pathogenic organisms. He completed his master's in Greek and Roman history at the University of Oxford between 2011 to 2012, and his PhD in history at University College London 2012 to 2016. Dr. Suresh, please.
Thank you, Clement. Let me just see if I can get the slides to move as well. Okay, it doesn't seem to be moving at my end.
Okay, so Dr. Sureshkumar, no problem. You can just say next slide and we will switch it for you. Or you can say the particular slide and then we will switch it for you.
So, when the Tang dynasty of China had been formally constituted in 618, the Pallavas were there for 300 years and would continue to do so until the 9th century. Change slides, please. The Pallava king Simhavishnu's conquest of the Kaveri Delta. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So the Pallava king Simhavishnu's conquest of the Kaveri Delta, the breadbasket of southern India in the mid-6th century, provided the economic basis for this kingdom's development into a significant regional power. They presided over an exceptional flowering of cultural and religious life. Change slide, please. The Pallavas are best known today for erecting some of the first structural temples of the Tamil-speaking country, built entirely in stone. Next slide, please. The most notable Pallava buildings are perhaps the 7th century rock-cut monuments at the port city of Mamallapuram, where the President of China, Xi Jinping, was hosted by Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, for the informal India-China summit just last October. Local and international media outlets made frequent reference to the long-standing historical connections the Tamil-speaking region enjoyed with China. The Pallavas were the first dynasty in the Tamil-speaking world to establish lasting diplomatic and commercial ties with China. Next slide, please. With 3 major ports along the Coromandel coast, functioning as vital nodes in trans-Eurasian transport and trade networks, the Pallavas were well disposed to engage in long-distance diplomatic and commercial enterprises. These port settlements include Mylapore in modern-day Chennai, Mamallapuram, which was the closest to the capital of Kanchipuram, and Nagapattinam, which serviced the newly conquered Kaveri Delta. In their self-estimation, the next slide, please. In their self-estimation, the Pallavas were a great maritime power. The Nandi Kalambagam, a 9th century Tamil poem on the Pallava king Nandivarman III, describes the latter as the earth protector, possessed of a navy, Kadarpadai Avaninaranan, and the lord of the 4 seas of white-foamed waves. The coins of the Pallavas occasionally bore the symbol of the double-masted ship, pointing to their maritime prowess. This was most tangibly expressed, perhaps, by the 2 naval expeditions to Sri Lanka in the 7th century under Narasimhavarman I, which resulted in the installation of a dynasty firmly allied to the Pallavas. Next slide, please. Direct Pallava Chinese connections begin, as it were, with the visit of the Chinese monk Xuanzang to the Pallava capital of Kanchipuram sometime around 642. Xuanzang provides us with a typical ethnographic account describing the produce of the land, the moral character of the people, and its religious landscape, in particular as it relates to Buddhism. Next slide, please. Kanchipuram, quite significantly in Chinese eyes, was a flourishing center of Buddhism. It would take almost a decade and a half after Xuanzang's visit for King Narasimhavarman to dispatch a delegation, perhaps the first such official Pallava mission to China in 658. That this was a novel enterprise is suggested by the fact that the mission of 658 was a joint delegation with 2 other South Indian kingdoms. Over the course of the late 7th century, Chinese official records indicate that a number of South Indian embassies, they're usually called Nan Tianzu in these official records, indicate that a number of South Indian embassies were dispatched to the Tang court. A few of these were presumably from the Pallavas. It is also certain that the Chalukyas, the sworn rivals of the Pallavas in South India, had dispatched embassies to China. One such Chalukyan mission in 691 is explicitly said to have been from the Chalukya king, Vallabha, also known as Vinayaditya. The Pallava Embassy of 720, next slide please. The Pallava Embassy of 720 has, however, made the largest impression on Chinese documentary sources, partly on account of its connection with the esoteric Buddhist teacher Vajrabuddhi. In older scholarly accounts, this name would be presented as Vajrabodhi, which is a kind of misback translation of the Sanskrit. It should be Vajrabuddhi, and this has been recently discussed by Ian Sinclair in an essay published in 2016. The reigning king, Narasimhavarman II, also known as Rajasimha, sought an alliance with the Tang court against the Arabs and Tibetans, then competitors to the Tang Empire in Central Asia. This periphrastic proposal of friendship was reciprocated with a Chinese mission to Kanchipuram. The cherry on the cake came in the form of a Buddhist temple constructed on behalf of China in Pallava territory. This is presumed to have been at the port city of Nagapattinam, which according to the Chinese monk Yijing, was indeed visited by Chinese monks. The Pallava and Tang realms were intimately connected by the movement of Buddhist monks, texts, and ideas. The most notable state-sponsored movement of a Buddhist acharya from the Pallava to the Tang court is surely the case of Vajrabuddhi, who arrived in China through the 720 Pallava Embassy. Next slide, please. And became an important teacher and translator of esoteric Buddhist texts. Vajrabuddhi was accompanied by a Pallava functionary called the general in Chinese sources actually, named Mijuna in Chinese sources, alongside carefully curated diplomatic gifts like a copy of the Prajna Paramita Sutra, jeweled furniture and ornaments, agarwood, Borneo camphor, and so on. Notice the presence of Southeast Asian products like agarwood and Borneo camphor. We will come back to the importance of Southeast Asia in determining the contours of Pallava-Chinese relations. What the Pallava court expected in return from this far-flung alliance and flamboyant display of friendship is far from clear in Chinese sources. Chinese trade goods were certainly circulating in the Pallava realm, and Chinese silk, next slide please. Next slide please. And Chinese silk appears to be the most important, or at least the most prominent commodity in Sanskrit and Pali sources belonging to the Pallava horizon. The 8th century Tamil Shaivite poet Sundarar, describing luxury products at the port of Nagapattinam, includes silk, likely Chinese rather than Indian in this instance. Next slide, please. Next one, please. Other Chinese imports included camphor, gold, variety of metals, and from the 8th century onwards, Changsha stoneware storage jars, often called dusun jars, which were possibly used as salt and tamarind containers in the Tamil world. There is little, however, to suggest that the Pallava embassies were motivated by commercial impulses alone, and it is best not to be over-enthusiastic about the regularity of direct Chinese Pallava commercial transactions. That even Indian monks had to board Southeast Asian ships to reach China suggests that Indian ships did not dock in Chinese ports with any regularity, as far as this period is concerned. It is likely that the Pallava proposal of friendship and close scrutiny of Chinese interests in Central Asia stems from their own geopolitical concerns in Southeast Asia, where the traditional Tamil mercantile sphere of influence in the Straits of Malacca was being challenged by the newly emergent power of Srivijaya, centered in Palembang in Sumatra. Next slide, please. There is reason to suspect that the Pallavas may have sought Chinese support as leverage against Srivijaya, a competitor and quite possibly obstruction to Tamil trading interests in the Straits of Malacca. Kumaradasa, a member of the Sri Lankan royal family installed by the Pallavas in the 7th century, obliquely refers to the frosty state of affairs between the Pallava Sri Lankan realms and Srivijaya in the Janaki Haranam, a Sanskrit poetic adaptation of the Ramayana. In somewhat anachronistic fashion, Kumaradasa describes the prowess of the legendary king Dasharatha scorching the east and causing the king of Kada to sweat in fear. In South Indian and Sri Lankan sources, the king of Srivijaya is almost invariably identified as the king of Kada. He's never called the king of Palembang, he is the king of Kada. It seems quite likely that Kumaradasa has projected Pallava political aspirations onto the legendary figure of Dasharatha, who is almost certainly modeled after his contemporary, the militarily successful Pallava king Narasimhavarman I. Remember, Narasimhavarman I was responsible for the installation of this new dynasty in Anuradhapura in Sri Lanka, as well as defeating the Chalukya king in the north, Pulakeshin, in battle in 642, the famous battle of Vatapi. There are enough documentary and archaeological sources. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. There are enough documentary and archaeological sources in the Thai-Malay Peninsula to suggest that Tamil merchants established permanent trading enclaves under Pallava auspices from the 7th century onwards, most notably at Takwapa and Satingpra at opposite ends of the peninsula. Quite significantly, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Quite significantly, a 9th century Tamil inscription from Takwapa pays no lip service whatsoever to local powers, and engages in the brazenly political act of naming the temple tank after the reigning Pallava king, Nandivarman III. Next slide, please. It is also significant in this regard to highlight the listing of the Chinese language, genome, in an 8th century Tamil lexicon, the Debachram, alongside other Southeast Asian languages like Savagam, which is either Malay or Javanese in this context, Kambodi, Khmer, and Arumanam, Mon. For Tamil audiences, the Chinese language would have first and foremost been encountered in a Southeast Asian setting, and the importance of Tang China for the Pallava realm should likewise be sought in Southeast Asia. The pattern of interaction between Tang China and the Pallavas would establish a prototype for the better known interactions of the succeeding Chora dynasty with both Southeast Asia and China. In the long run, the Choras proved successful in eliminating Srivijaya and the Southeast Asian middlemen plying Chinese goods. The subsequent blossoming of direct and regularized Tamil contact with China is best exemplified by the spectacular material remains of Hindu temples in the late Chora provincial style at the port city of Yangzhou in Fujian province. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sureshkumar. We'll move on to the last speaker for this panel. The last speaker for today is Dr. Derek Heng, and the title of his presentation is Imported Material Culture and the Hybridization, Adaptation, and Cosmopolitanization of Consumption Patterns in Malay Port City between the 10th to 14th century. Dr. Derek Heng is professor and chair of the History Department at Northern Arizona University. He specializes in the pre-modern trans-regional history of maritime Southeast Asia and the South China Sea, utilizing textual and archaeological data to study the interaction between Southeast Asia and China and their impact on the state formation process in coastal Southeast Asia. Dr. Heng, please.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to the Asian Civilizations Museum for inviting me to present this paper this morning over in Singapore and over here in the US in the evening. So just as a preamble, and there we go, great. So just as a preamble, I think one of the things that we've taken away today so far with all the papers has been the really vibrant economic interactions between China and island Southeast Asia over the course of the late first and into the early second millennium AD. I mean, one of the big questions that we really need to ask is definitely, at least in terms of the end, the receiving end of the market, is that as goods were exchanged, to what extent did one region in terms of its economic and material cultural output influence the material and cultural aspects of life and society in the receiving market over in Southeast Asia. And this is particularly important when you really think about the distance between the two regions is actually fairly significant and substantial. And to some extent, the notion of imperialism, which very often we think of as a much more superior political entity taking over maybe a lesser sort of a powerful political entity comes to mind. But imperialism also comes in other ways and forms as well, including economic codependency, where cultural developments that are initiated and reinforced in one region as a result of the economic and cultural output of another, and the utilization of that in the recipient market becomes one of the important processes over the course of time, especially when there's substantial and intense economic interaction between the two regions involved. So the paper today really is more of a thought paper. It's not really sort of portraying ongoing research in that it's not really looking at data on the ground and so on and so forth, but really sort of thinking about one aspect of this broader economic exchange and interaction dynamic, which is the foodstuff containers from South China that were exported out of South China around about the 14th century and into the early 15th century, and then obviously showing up in places like Singapore in the 14th century and the port city of Marseille. And the main question being, to what extent was the South Chinese economy a factor in the development of the material cultural consumption patterns of these port cities in island Southeast Asia. So just a map, just to sort of contextualize it, because if we were talking to a Singaporean audience, we will all know where Temasek is, but I noticed that we actually have a huge number of folks who are attending that are from outside of, in fact, Southeast Asia. So we're really looking at this part of Southeast Asia, very often called the Malay region, where there has always been a series of many, many different ports through time, particularly in the period that we're thinking about, that all the papers have been looking at. And Temasek really is Singapore Island there, which existed for about approximately 100 years, around about the 14th century. So quite a lot of ports. And of course, in Singapore, over the last 35 years, various teams have conducted a huge number of excavations in the downtown area where the 14th century settlement was located about 700 years ago. A great range of archaeological remains have been unearthed over the 35 years or so of excavations, including gold, ornaments, fine ceramics from China, particularly the south, Longquan ware, for example, whiteware and blue and whiteware from Jingdezheng, as well as places like Dehua in the 14th century. Also earthenware from Southeast Asia, which is that small little picture with the red ceramics at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. But one of the biggest class or categories of remains that have actually been unearthed in Singapore are these kinds of ceramics. Not terribly beautiful, and really they are storage jars, often utilized to contain things like foodstuffs. And it's not the jars themselves and these ceramics that are important, but the content in them that we are really sort of thinking about, at least in terms of this talk that I'm giving right now. The couple of characteristics that we can sort of deduce from the coarse stoneware ceramics that have been excavated in Singapore from the 14th century site. Four main types of wares that we can observe. Firstly, ceramic containers that were capable of containing high density items. And so these are sort of items that could be relatively heavy, including things, for example, like fermented fish, fermented meats, certain kinds of protein products, even vegetable products that have substantial liquid content in them. And so their densities are relatively high. And just to show you a photograph of what we're thinking about. This is an example of one of those jars. This is from the Belitung wreck, but and it's not containing foodstuffs, but at least in this case, it was carrying lead ingots. But it gives you a sense of how robust this particular kind of ceramics could be in terms of the amount of weight that it could actually contain, right? And so along with that, obviously, the foodstuffs that are put in these jars tend to be of fairly substantial weight. The other type of stoneware ceramics tend to be these kinds where, if you can just notice the picture, the clay fabric of the jars are actually quite poor. They structurally relatively weak because of the amount of inclusions that are in the clay body. This is another example of that, which we've just sort of termed as a sugary textured one, just to give a sense of what the clay body looks like. Some of these jars that have been reconstructed from the archaeological sort of finds can stand roughly about 60 to 70 centimeters tall. So they're really very large jars, but the bodies are extremely thin, and the structural integrity of these jars are actually very, very weak, which suggests that anything that you put in there has to be of lower density as opposed to a higher density. So they tend to carry things that are bulky, but not very, very heavy at all. And then you have a third kind of ceramic storage jars that you find in 14th century Singapore, which are these liquid containers. They are relatively small. They tend to be of standardized capacity, and they are impervious to liquid penetration. So they could be used for containing and sort of shipping liquids, including things like rice wines, the possibility of sauces, and so on and so forth. And a fourth type, of course, stoneware ceramic, which tends to be more of a tool as opposed to just be a storage container for other things. So basins, for example, like the one we have on the left side of the picture, as well as mortars on the right, which is used for grinding. And so these are culinary equipment that are used for the preparation of food, which have been produced in South China and were exported to Singapore in the 14th century. The consistency of the exports of all of these kinds of coarse stoneware ceramics, as far as we can identify them. And this map just sort of shows us the rough proportions of where, for example, the buff clay stonewares, which are the really robust ones carrying heavy weight, come from, primarily from the kilns around the port of Guangzhou. And then you have, for example, the brittle type that would likely carry items that are bulky but of very low density and that are relatively light, from places like the Quanzhou area, where a number of these ceramics have been sort of linked to. And then, of course, the liquid jars, like the small mouth bottle type jars, the zizao wares, which were produced in the Quanzhou area, as well as much further up north, for example, in the Yixing kilns. And then some of the other items that are including, for example, certain types that are gray, that may have been located, for example, in the Jianyang area in northern Fujian. What is interesting is that regardless of which site you excavate and then you sort of look at the ceramic material in Singapore in the 14th century, you will find a relatively consistent proportion of all these ceramics showing up in all the sites, right? And what that suggests is that we are looking at a very consistent demand and supply pattern, right, that existed in, at least in ports like Singapore, for example, in the 14th century, from about the late 13th century into the early 15th century. And so this demand and supply pattern, to some extent, very much like some of the ceramics that we saw, for example, Andrew Chittig's presentation, is not incidental. They are very, very specific and also very deliberate and extremely consistent and over a significant period of time. The other thing that is really interesting is the specificity of the demand. So high density foodstuffs, for example, coming primarily from Guangdong province, whereas the low density foodstuffs primarily from South Fujian, and then liquids coming primarily from the Zizao area around the port city of Quanzhou, Jianyang in Fuzhou, as well as in the Yixing area where we have the port cities of Yangzhou and Hangzhou located. And at the same time, in terms of the macro picture of the foodstuffs import pattern that we see in the 14th century in Singapore, we find that 70% of the core stoneware ceramics are from China. And if you contrast that to the northern half of the Malacca Straits in places, for example, like Kota China or southern Kedah, which do have port cities of about the contemporaneous period here, roughly the late 13th into the 14th century, we find instead that South Asian earthenware formed the majority of these sorts of ceramics. And so the demand pattern from a trans-regional point of view is actually quite interestingly different depending on which part of the Malacca Straits we are looking at here. So let me see if I can move the slide. Yeah. So a couple of things I think that one could observe as we think about the coarse stoneware ceramic patterns that is evident in the late 13th through to the early 14th century, 15th century in Singapore. If we compare the data from 4 different sites located in this particular port settlement as a case example, what we find is that not only would the types of products, foodstuffs in particular, coming into port cities like Singapore being very consistently supplied by China over more than a 100-year period. Once the products arrive in the port city, though, the nature of the demand within the port settlement itself actually can differ. And so depending on where the subgroup is located, if it is, for example, located in along the riverbank of the Singapore River, or over at the foothills of Fort Canning Hill, or on top of Fort Canning Hill, the actual demand for these different kinds of foodstuffs from China actually can differ. And what that suggests is that we are actually looking at the articulation of subgroup differences within one very small port city, utilizing commodities that are coming in from South China in a very consistent basis, right? And so therefore, they're sort of articulating their subgroup identity and differentiation through the material culture that's being made available for them. And in this case, obviously, it's the foodstuffs that we're thinking about. So just a couple of questions, I think, as we sort of, as I round off this presentation. And the first one, of course, is why is there such a development of an economic codependency over time, right? Why did the Marseille import foodstuffs from South China if it was likely that they could produce foodstuffs themselves? And that's a very important question, partly because the supply market is actually extremely far away. And one could think about the consistency of the exchange between South China and Singapore, port cities like Temasek in Singapore, as well as the rest of the Malay region, as a possibility that allows them the opportunity to develop such an economic codependency over time. The second question, of course, is why is it that the development of dependency on South China for certain types of foods? So places like the hinterlands of Guangzhou, for example, are known for certain kinds of food products in the end of the Song and into the Yuan period in the 14th century. And so there's a semblance that South China basically over time has become an extended agricultural base for port cities and populations, for example, in Temasek. And along with that, obviously, the adoption of culinary preparation tools and practices from South China. We had a paper by Dr. Chen just now showing a tripod, a metal tripod, and that's another, we're talking about coarse stoneware here, but it's not, those are not the only things that we have in this particular site. The records of iron tripods that actually lead to different kinds of ways that you could cook food, as opposed to just stewing, for example, in earthenware pots. You could be doing things like frying, stir frying, and so on and so forth. All of those create culinary consumption patterns, right, that over time become part of the identity of the subgroups of this particular location. And finally, the reinforcement of subgroup differentiations within a small settlement like Singapore. In Temasek in the 14th century probably did not have anything more than about 1,000 or 2,000 people at any one point in time. And yet you can still find subgroup differentiations within such a small population base, expressed in fairly interesting things like culinary culture. And so just to sort of end off, it's a sort of simple graph chart thing that I sort of worked out just to sort of provide a sense of what foodstuff importation, which begins with trade early on, and as the supply becomes consistent, it reinforces certain consumption patterns that develop economic codependency, and then ultimately results in the manifestation of subgroup differentiation, and that's where the hybridization and the adaptation takes place, and then it becomes a reinforcing cyclical pattern over time. And I think that is some of the things that we're seeing, at least with regards to the storage jars from South China that we've been excavating in Singapore over the last 35 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Lester, I'll hand it over to you first.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Clement On, and thank you very much to all our speakers. So, ladies and gentlemen, before we go over to our next segment, which is the panel discussion, well, I'd like to ask you to please kindly post your questions for this session by clicking on the Q&A icon right at the bottom of the screen. Now, also, once again, you can upvote questions by clicking on the like button also. All right, so of course, it's great to see a lot of conversation going on. Some of you do have domain knowledge in certain aspects that the speakers were speaking about. So of course, some of you helped to answer as well. So that's great. Let's keep this conversation flowing. And of course, Mr. Clement will be resuming the panel discussion. Once again, I'd like to ask you to please submit your questions. If you have any particular question you want to direct it to any of our panelists, please do state their name. I would also like to request that you please kindly state your name and perhaps your organization that you are from. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the time over back to our panel chair, Mr. Clement On. Mr. On, please.
Thank you, Lester. Once again, thank you to all our panelists and for your wonderful insights and sharing your research in all the fields that we have covered this morning. I think there are already quite a few questions that came in along the way, and subsequently, I think some of our speakers have already sort of replied back or offered some kind of we take it offline contact points for it. But just to bring up, this to sum up the conversation that we're having. I think there are a few questions. Maybe I'll just turn it to Dr. Chen and Dr. Chi first. I'll ask some of the questions directly to them because of the interpretation that will take some time, I believe. I think there are a few questions that come up regarding, I think this is for Dr. Chi, in terms of metal wood. Is metal wood iron wood, for example? And there is also another question regarding about, let me just find, how common is metal wood found in China? How common or rare were these trees perhaps could they be imported from Vietnam or Thailand, from Southeast Asia, for instance? And then there is something that is more sort of specific in terms of conservation science, that if metal wood appear as iron wood, did Dr. Chi's team did any wood identification analysis of those artifacts that were excavated? Could there be iron components from the soil entered the wood, giving its appearance? So maybe if Dr. Chi could share a little bit more about that later on. And then the question to Dr. Chen from an ex-colleague. You shared two rare relics, sort of in the shape of a pagoda, Buddhist relics with figures, and they seem to have some kind of a narrative relief scene on them. It seems that they have strong Indian stylistic features, or could you share a little bit more about the excavation of what you have found in the pagodas? And in the meantime, while the interpreters are getting the questions to our Mandarin speakers, turning back to Andrew, I think we have answered a few questions, but one of the few questions that they came up, links back to the inscriptions, the branding of some of these wares. Would you like to talk more a little bit about that? As in your studies, how many of these sort of a rough number in terms of the family surnames have we sort of consolidated?
So far as I know, from the Changsha ware, we have maybe about a dozen different family names or surnames that have shown up on different Changsha ware. Only a few of those showed up in the Belitung wreck. Most of them have been found at Changsha or at other at other land sites where Changsha ware has been found. There was a question on there about branding versus quality control, and I was interested in that question, but also thinking that a branding of ceramics is actually a kind of quality control, in the sense that the brand is advertising the quality of the good. That is, people brand items in order to let the purchaser know that the good is of a certain quality. So I would assume that any family that was branding their goods with their family name was attempting to exert some kind of quality control over those goods in order to develop a reputation for quality. But again, that's mostly hypothetical for this early period. We don't actually have any direct textual evidence of, of what they were thinking and what they were intending.
Just to continue the conversation with you, there was another question that we wondered, were these ships making the entire journey from the Middle East to China, or did the transportation of goods rely on regional networks in Arabian Sea, Bay of Bengal, South China Sea? I would assume so, that the ships would have to provision supplies and would have to even provision labor as well in the ship. So what's your sort of take on it?
Yeah, I think the trading networks are obviously going to be really complex. I do think that, some large loads of goods in this period actually would have traveled directly from China to the Middle East. But the ships, of course, would have to stop routinely on the way in order to resupply, especially water, but also potentially to replace or to hire other people. There's certainly some evidence that that the Belitung ship itself had people who were not Middle Easterners on board, that they hired Southeast Asian and perhaps Chinese people to do to be on board the ship to do work of some kind. So obviously, as Dr. Sen pointed out in his keynote last night, the shipboard life was actually quite culturally complex, so it's important to, he was mostly building that off of later information, but I think we can assume that that was certainly the case in earlier periods as well.
Thank you. Would Dr. Chen or Dr. Chi have are ready to? Please go ahead if you are. Hi, Dr. Chen。
那就谢海林先来吗？
啊，行，那我先说吧，好吧，师兄。这样，我来跟大家回答一下刚才提到的那个铁梨木的问题。铁梨木可能不叫铁木，铁梨木的它的这个现在标准名称叫做革木。我刚才还查了一下它的英文的名字，但是我可能读不太准。叫 Erythroprom， 就是我把它英文字母给大家拼一下 ERYTHROPHLEUM， 它的标准名称叫革木。铁梨木是我们中国人在历史明代的时候给它的一个名称，跟铁没有关系。它里面并不含铁，只是它的颜色是黑颜色的，所以说古人认为这个跟铁的颜色比较接近，而且它的木质又比较坚硬，像铁一样坚硬，所以把它叫做铁梨木。那么我们就这个问题，我是曾经请教过植物学家，就是南京林业大学的相关的教授，他们告诉我，这种革木自古就是从明朝开始就很清楚，在中国的这个北温带是不可能生长的，它在中国有可能生长的地方就是云南、广西、广州这一带。那么在明朝的文献当中，铁梨木是有明确记，就是当时明朝的时候船分成好多种，它是按照产地来分的。比如说有福船，就是福建造的船叫福船，有在广东造的船就叫广船，其中广船上明确讲，广船需要用铁梨木来制造，就是在广州，在中国南部造的船，那个海船是要铁梨木来造。那么我个人认为，在广州造的这个船，那么当时是它能够有条件，在广东、广西这一带找到原产的这个铁梨木，但是很有可能也是从云南从这个缅甸、越南这边进口的这个铁梨木。那么之所以在南京发现这个铁梨木，我们认为是这个船只把这个要么是把加工好的构件运到了南京组装，或者是把有一批原木运到了南京，在南京宝船厂进行加工，这是有可能的。但是这个原料的产地肯定不是在南京，这是我的一个回答。铁梨木跟铁没关系，它只是一种特别坚硬的木材，自古就是从明朝开始就被认为是制作海船最好的木材之一啊，这是我的回答。
好，谢谢你，齐老师。
那我来回答刚才的一个问题。 刚才有人提问，就是那两座我们叫阿育王塔或者佛塔的那种文物，这两个实际上是应该说那是从那个我们那个佛塔地宫里面出土的，那个佛塔地宫的年代应该是北宋时期的这样一个文物，然后它这两件的话实际上是比较接近于我们江浙一带的就吴越时期的阿育王塔的这样一个风格。因为阿育王塔本身就是仿造印度佛教所做的一个特殊的这样一个供奉品，所以它可能会在本身佛塔的周边都是一些佛本身故事，会有一些这种佛教题材的东西，但是可能跟传统的那个印度佛教的还是有一些这种文物还是有一些区别的。刚才那个斯里兰卡的那个朋友就想更多的了解，我说如果想更多了解，我们可以私下去分享这样一个信息，让大家有更多关注的人来一起来研究。好吧。
Thank you, Dr. Chi and Dr. Chen. Just to continue this conversation as well, in your archaeological excavation, in your projects, did you also find products, objects that were not locally produced in China, meaning there would be some kind of a foreign civilization or small community that was established living in China, trading at that point in time, or perhaps some of the items that were exported that were not Chinese origin in your work. While we wait.
就我这边而言，宝丹场遗址而言，就是这个革木的这个革木的材料是我们认为是很有可能是从国外进口的，但是我们还没有发现因为宝船厂它是一个造船的基地，它并不是一个物资的交流的一个场所，所以它大部分的材料，大部分所有的材料、工具都是中国自产的。除了这个刚才我讲的这个铁梨木这个是有可能是从国外进口的之外，我们还没有发现太多的这个国外进口的这个证据。这是我这个遗址的表现。
因为在那个上海青龙镇遗址里面，因为它是这样一个贸易港口，但是当时候唐宋时期的双方的贸易的话，可能更多输入的是一些像刚才讲的木材、香料这一类的，不容易保存。但是我们在青龙镇遗址刚才讲的那个龙平寺塔的地宫里面，曾经在那个就是最里面那种双凤那个释迦牟尼卧佛像的旁边，可能是发现有点像乳香的这种遗物，但是没有最后确认它的物质组成。我们怀疑这类的香的可能疑似是香的这种遗存的话，可能会来自国外。但是这个证据相对来讲还是比较小的，因为比较少的，因为有机质的材料相对保存下来的几率相对比较小。所以我们现在能够看到的大量的都是一些像陶瓷器这种残件。
Thank you, Dr. Chen and Dr. Chi. Turning to Dr. Heng, Derek, one of the questions from one of our colleagues, Rie Ong, was asking if you could share a little bit more about how you arrived at the conclusion that these stonewares that you have studied were used for food products. Are there any textual evidence, cross-referencing of similar types of stonewares found elsewhere?
Yeah, so I think there are some examples in shipwrecks. The Belitung wreck is one very good example of that. The Intan wreck being another one. Where these storage jars do contain foodstuffs in them. There is a early 15th century wreck that was found off the Gulf of Siam, and that had different kinds of foodstuffs as well, not necessarily from South China, but further sort of along the mainland Southeast Asian coastline. And so it looks like that's actually a pretty common practice of shipping foodstuffs across this region of trade that we're looking at, obviously, which with Temasek being located in one. There are quite a number of textual references in the Chinese textual documentation corpus that talks about foodstuff trade and, what are some of the foodstuffs that have been traded within Southeast Asia, as well as, imported from China. The big problem, obviously, as most of the archaeologists that we have will attest to, and that is that because we are looking at organic material, very often the big challenge is that most of these materials would have already, decomposed. Right? And then for food, there's obviously the extremely high chance that they've all been eaten up before the jar got thrown away. And so to some extent, I think it's important for me to indicate that, these are not definitive conclusions that we can obviously make. They are, to some extent, substantial postulations too. That we know that these are jars that are utilized in China for the containing of food, stuffs, and carrying, and that's an established fact. So using that, we can extrapolate that to sort of think about how those items could have been utilized in Southeast Asia. But that's one of the interesting and exciting things about looking at the pre-modern period. We kind of have a sense about it. We are always never entirely sure. We get very excited when we find a couple of these things, in a shipwreck, for example, and everybody sort of goes crazy about it. And then further down the road, we might just be proven wrong, right? And so it's an extremely interesting and exciting discourse that we always engage in, especially in the pre-modern period and the period of organic material.
Absolutely agree with you, Derek. Turning back to Andrew, I've got a question from Mr. Kwa Chong Wan. Who bores the financial losses of the Beitou cargo, the Chinese exporter or the Western Asian buyers? How was the loss shared? Do you have any insights that you could share on this question?
Well, that's a great question. Wouldn't we like to know? My assumption, and again, this is even more hypothetical than Derek's guess there, is that the kiln sold all of its ware to a purchasing agent in Yangzhou, or potentially to whoever was the master of the Belitung ship. So the kiln had already pocketed its profit long before the ship got to Southeast Asia. So the loss is almost certainly lands on the head of whoever it was that commissioned the ship. I mean, we certainly know that the Arab shipmasters, when they returned to the Middle East, made substantial profits on the trade. But of course, we only hear that about the ones that got home successfully. This is part of the reason also why I think that the kilns would have only made only filled the order when they'd received an order when the ship had already got into port in Yangzhou, because you really wouldn't want to make all of those bowls if you didn't have a ship to put them on. And a certain percentage of the ships never made it to Yangzhou. I mean, some of them went down on the outward journey, not on the return journey. So you really want a ship in port before you're going to send all of those ceramics down the Yangtze River to it. But yeah, my assumption is that the loss would have been on the heads of the shipmasters. But again, that's another one of those hypotheticals.
Thank you, Andrew. Turning to Dr. Sureshkumar, in your presentation and in your research in general, have you come of any, because yesterday during the keynote speech by Dr. Tan Sen, we talk about, some of the aspects that usually were not discussed or not presented, basically because sort of lack of material archaeological findings. In terms of your research and the diplomatic contact between the Pallavas and Tang China, were there any sort of textual records or references that talks about conflicts or difficulties in dealing between the two sort of empires?
So as far as we can tell, there doesn't seem to be any hint of conflict. It's really, all flowery and friendly between the Pallava and Tang courts. And so the novelty of my argument is that the Pallavas were really trying to use China as leverage against this power that they were in conflict with in Southeast Asia, Srivijaya, which often appears in this hostile language that we have seen, for instance, in the Sanskrit text that I pointed out, dating to the 7th century. So if there's an enemy here, it's Srivijaya, which is very often not named as well. And that by itself is a testament to this kind of frosty relationship that there is between these two powers. So as far as Tang China is concerned, it seems to be more of an ally in this wider geopolitical scheme. One thing that I missed out because of lack of time was, of course, the religious element, which also which Tan Sen also mentioned, the movement of monks and pilgrims and so on. There was a growing idea that bodhisattvas in Mahayana Buddhism had specific earthly abodes. So, of course, in China, Mount Wutai is the abode of Manjushri. He was kind of the patron bodhisattva of China. And by the 7th century, there was this growing idea that Avalokiteshvara, Guan Yin, was based in a locality identified somewhere in the Western Ghats, so basically in the Tamil country. And the first Chinese author to explicitly talk about this is Xuanzang. And we also see it in the biographies of Vajrabuddhi. So in the famous biography written by his lay disciple, Liu Xiang, he basically says when his teacher boarded the boat, this was in Tamil Nadu in India, he turned westwards and bowed towards Avalokiteshvara and turned eastwards and bowed towards Manjushri. So there's this firm idea that Avalokiteshvara had his physical abode in the Tamil country, and that it's also made it, this place of great interest to Chinese Buddhists of the Tang period.
And you mentioned earlier there's this text about the 18 languages.
Yes.
Could you share a little bit more about that, about the Debachram, and were there sort of language schools or institutions, or even in the monastery that were instructing in some of these foreign languages?
So a bit about the text of Debachram. This is basically a kind of extended glossary commentary that has about 9,500 entries. So when it's printed, it's about 3 volumes long. And the part that I quoted is from the later part of this glossary, which gives us a list of nouns, and this list of 18 languages comes from that section, and presumably these were languages that were really important to the Tamil people, otherwise it wouldn't make sense for them to be listed in this context. And what's really interesting is that Chinese comes right smack in between these Southeast Asian languages, right? And that tells us that this is a language that they must have been familiar with, must have encountered in a Southeast Asian context first and foremost. And of course, the identity of all the Southeast Asian languages is not clear. I think there was a question on what Javagam actually means. Is it Malay? Is it Javanese? But Javaka is basically a generic term in Tamil for anyone who comes in from Southeast Asia, from archipelagic Southeast Asia. You don't necessarily need to be from Java. In fact, if you go to northern Sri Lanka, in the Jaffna region, there are places called Javaga Kote, Javaga Cheri, the settlement of the Javakans. And this is referring to a later 13th century settlement of archipelagic Southeast Asian, presumably Malay speakers rather than Javanese speakers in that part of Sri Lanka.
Thank you. Few questions for Derek, Dr. Heng. One of which was asking if you know of one of the main resource of liquid that could be found at the jar. Could it be mercury, or could it be, or could mercury be used as sort of a medicine? And do we know if it's mercury, what's the origin of the liquid?
Right.
So,
so the hypothesis of the possibility of some of these jars that were utilized for containing and shipping and trading mercury came in the early 1970s by a scholar in the Sarawak Museum, I believe, where the base of these jars are actually extremely thickly potted. So they're very narrow, but they're very, very heavy at the base. And the postulation was that liquid mercury could have been contained in these jars because the heavy bottom of the ceramic jar would allow for the weight of the liquid mercury to be contained well and not sort of topple over. And if it was true that there was mercury, then mercury is typically used for the extraction of gold out of quartz. That's the possibility, obviously, for ritual use of mercury as well. That's looking at it from the Southeast Asian perspective, right, of what we kind of know of Southeast Asian cultural practices and so on and so forth. More recently, though, I think over the last 20 years or more, the Chinese archaeologists in places like in South Fujian, for example, in the Zizhao district and so on and so forth, have actually produced reports that show that these jars were produced in very, very large quantities in the kiln areas that were close to the south, to the Quanzhou port in the 13th, 14th, 15th century. And there is also no physical evidence of mercury, both in terms of being produced in that part of China, as well as obviously being found in the jars in Southeast Asia. So I think the conclusion, at least at this juncture, in terms of the scholarly consensus, definitely on the China side, is that we may be looking at jars that were just produced in vast quantities for containing, it's like beer bottles, for example, if we think of it that way. What is really fascinating is that these jars actually have very, very standard displacement volumes. And so, they all were made in a particular shape with a particular volume. And the likelihood of the liquid that they would have been made, to contain as a trade commodity would have to have been something that was very, very widely traded, and one that was traded in fairly large volumes as well. And I'm not sure if mercury would have necessarily fell into that category. Once the jars come into Southeast Asia, they could have been utilized, reused, repurposed for mercury in certain parts of Southeast Asia, possibly. But again, at this juncture, that's the consensus is not towards that.
Thank you, Derek. Just to continue the conversation with you once again, there's a question from Catherine Koo, a PhD candidate in NTU. She's looking at imperialism and the Catholic priests in China. Although I think it falls out of the time frame that you're talking about today, but would you like to have a take on it? Is religion subservient to imperialism, or does it concur with it?
Yeah, I think this is one of the big sort of large-scale history questions that we have for the history of imperialism, right? And that is that, do we only see imperialism necessarily as, military conquest, territorial administration, and so on and so forth? To some extent, that is true. I think a lot of what we think about in terms of imperial history is framed by Western imperialism. If you really look at the history of imperialism in Asia, though, and particularly in East Asia, especially during the Song and the Song period in particular, imperialism tends to take a form of asymmetrical power relations between large states and small states. And military conquest and territorial administration is usually not necessarily what makes that happen. And what we do see are economic relationships that are extremely intense, that over time, the weaker political entity actually becomes dependent on the much stronger political entity, so that this asymmetrical relationship actually begins to exist, and it becomes solidified to a large extent and lasts for a very long time. So to the question about religion and thinking about China, for example, the thing about religion and China, and I wasn't sure whether she was referring to Christianity, for example, trying to make its headway into China. One of the biggest things that we can see, obviously, is that civilizationally, the asymmetrical relationship, in fact, is in China's favor, particularly in the early modern and modern period. So much so that I think we can't really argue for cultural imperialism. I mean, they may have, the Jesuits may have tried, but I think overall they were not really as successful as I think sometimes we might want to think about that in that way. If we think about other religions, though, in Southeast Asia, then we could think of, for example, even to some extent, the Sanskritic religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, actually being able to play that asymmetrical relationship extremely well. And obviously, by the early modern period, Islam becomes a big deal in island Southeast Asia.
Absolutely agree with you. And even if we talk about the Christianity in China, well, the Jesuit, like you mentioned, I agree that there might be some kind of a business or imperialism in their approach come to the 16th century in the Ming Dynasty period. But even in the 13th, 14th century, I think some of the earlier missionaries were Franciscan in Chinese court, and even they appear in many parts of Central Asia and in the Yuan Dynasty as well. And I don't think there is much success or even connections to where they're coming from. I think it's more towards of preaching and propagating the faith, the order that they are from, in a way.
Yeah.
Turning to Dr. Chi, there is a question in Mandarin over here in the chat group by someone from the, I think, Berkeley University in the history faculty, Sean Cronum. He's asking Dr. Chi about one of the reference that you used during your talk. I'm going to say this in Mandarin because I don't quite know what's the right translation for it. So Sean was asking, 请问您所引用的那个兵部档案是哪里找来的? I'm not too sure how this translates into English, but I think it's more of the military documents for it. If Dr. Chi could share with us the source.
Oh, I know. 就是讲的是这个郑和航海图吗？是指那个是
I think so. 应该是。
那个郑和航海图这个研究已经很深入了，就是它在我们可以查到的最早版本的郑和航海图有2个，最早的一个是叫做武备志，它的作者是明代的叫毛元仪，这么一个人叫毛元仪。另外一本就是跟他几乎同时代，相差不了几年的叫做南书志。这个武备志的这个作者毛元仪，他的祖父是南京兵部的一个郎中，就是当时南京国防部的一个高级官员。这个已经有很多学者研究过这个武备志的成书的经历，就是毛元仪利用南京兵部的档案编纂了武备志。这个郑和航海图就是武备志当中收录的一幅图，这是一个方面。另外一个，我刚才讲另外一本书叫做南书志，南书志它的直接的编撰者就是当时明代最后一个南京兵部的叫做兵部尚书，甚至国防部长，他是这本书的直接的这个组织编撰的人，在这本书里面也收录了郑和航海图。所以说我说这个郑和航海图是来自于当时明代的国防部的文件，是这么来的，这个是没有疑问的，因为这2本书的研究已经很深入了。
好，谢谢齐老师。Turning another question to Dr. Sureshkumar from a Japanese participant, Aoyama Toru. He's asking, does the order of the 18 languages has any significance? Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I do see some significance in Chinese being listed together in the midst of these Southeast Asian languages, but I can't determine if the order of languages holds much significance. This would need further consideration. But it's interesting that the list actually ends with an unidentified country called Debachram, from the Sanskrit Varvara or Barbara, which literally means the barbarian country. So, if we see this as a kind of progression of, civilized countries to non-civilized, if we go along that idea, then we would be saying that everything right at the end is kind of barbaric and uncivilized in Pallava eyes. But at present, I don't think that's the case. But one needs to really think about the ordering as well and compare this with later lists of countries and languages that we have to see if this is kind of a formulaic way of just representing them.
Thank you. Before we go on and answering the Q&A, I just wonder, I'm opening to all the panelists. If you have any questions for each other, do feel free to come in. And sorry, someone's trying to say anything? Just as we are, as we are closing into the end of this panel session, I think I have one question back to Derek. Since we're talking about food containers, and as we are heading to lunchtime in this part of the world, so in your research, did you manage to find any textual records or evidence about food recipes of the 10th to 14th century in Southeast Asia, or was there any exchanges of recipes that the Chinese settlers in Southeast Asia would also have brought back to China as well?
Actually, personally, no. I have not actually seen any recipes. That would really be very interesting. But what we do have in terms of textual material, and again, the Chinese textual material tends to predominate in this period of time that we're looking at. The accounts of, or the entries of the different port cities of Southeast Asia do mention sometimes the types of food that may be consumed. They tend to be very cursory because that actually is not the biggest concern they have, right? So for example, the 14th century text, the Tao Yi Ziliu, for example, talks about things like the kinds of grains that are grown, the types of cereal crops that are grown there. So obviously, presumably that meant that they would be consuming those things. The fermenting of wine, what are the types of ingredients that are used. Marco Polo, for example, at the end of the 13th century does have a few entries on the Straits of Malacca, places like Samudra, talking about certain kinds of alcoholic, beverages that are available. But by and large, they are few and far between. Those sorts of accounts tend to show up when the Europeans appear. And I think it has to do with that notion of the other, right? Once the other that you're observing is so dramatically different that you tend to pick up on these observations that are really sort of distinct from what you're familiar with. And I think that's where the Europeans were very good at that, because obviously they were seeing things that they were really very unfamiliar with. Whereas probably for the Chinese, over the many centuries where you have, for example, the Quanzhou wreck, importing large quantities of black pepper from Southeast Asia, betel nuts and so on and so forth, that probably for the Chinese, especially along the coastal south, they were already so familiar with the kind of culinary range of ingredients in Southeast Asia that these sorts of things were not really necessarily very unusual for them as observations. And so they probably didn't really pick those things up as much. Yeah. Oh, there's one last thing I would add very quickly in 10 seconds. There is a early 12th century text, and Andrew can correct me if I got the date wrong. The Pingzhou Ketan talks about the foreign quarter in Guangzhou. And in there is some observation of the different kinds of food that the foreign sojourners in the port city of Guangzhou were consuming. I mean, he was talking about what they were doing in the foreign quarter, and food was one of the topics that he actually recorded as an observation as well. So for those of I don't think there's an English translation of that text, but if for those of the audience that can actually read the classical Chinese from the 12th century, that would be an interesting one that you can actually go to.
Thank you, Derek. I think we have covered most of the questions, in fact, all of the questions, and some of the questions have been answered directly by our speakers of this panel. So with this, is there any questions between the panelists again? If not, I will hand over to our MC. Everyone okay? Great, thank you. Thank you once again, everyone, for contributing and participating in this panel. Very happy to have you all for sharing your research with us today. Thank you to all our participants who are tuning in, whether you are with the Zoom or the Facebook Live streaming right now. Again, huge apologies for some of the technical delays and lags. These things happen, but once again, thank you for bearing with us and